Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Kaf Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Gabrielle Altman in loving memory of Yechezkel Yitzchak ben Shlomo Zev, Honorable Herbert Altman Zichrono Livracha on his Shloshim. Beloved husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, brilliant jurist and wonderful Jew who will be forever cherished, missed, and loved. Yehi Zichro Baruch. Today's daf is sponsored by Becky Goldstein in honor of the marriage of cousin Aviva Engel to Mickey Fankhauser, the Aliyah of her parents from Montreal to Modi'in. She welcomes her brother, Rabbi Tzvi Engel from Chicago, who will be the Masada Kiddushin. My heart is full of thanksgiving to Hashem for all his chasadim. Varikoti lachem bracha, atzlacha avilidai. Okay, with that, we'll get started. Mention of Chicago reminded me to mention that I'll be speaking there also as well on July 31st. So if anyone knows people there or wants to join, wants to come, you're all invited. So you can email us at info@hadran.org.il. We'll forward you details. Okay, what did we do yesterday? We started with this issue of distancing the ladder from your neighbor's dovecote 4 cubits. Okay, by the way, if we want to talk about dovecotes, it was the end of class yesterday, but dovecotes, they're also called columbaria or columbarium, which you can find, I mentioned in the Beit Shemesh area, there's a bunch, and there's all these indentations in the walls that they made basically in order to have places for the doves to go. And it would basically attract doves, and they would also be able to keep them there and take care of them. So you can go visit when you're in Israel if you've never seen them. It's worth, getting to see what this is in actuality. You can also Google, there's lots of pictures. Anyway, see also Masada, you can find them. Thanks, Stacy Beit Guvrin. Okay, now, we're going to start with a story that's going to be very similar to the end of yesterday's daf. Rav Yosef Havalu Hanu Tale. He had palm trees. Davuatu umane v'yatvu tutayu. And there were all these bloodletters that would do their bloodletting work under his trees. I guess it provided shade. And even though date trees don't provide the most amount of shade, but they would do it under there for whatever reason. Va'atu orve achle dama v'salke v'yatve, there's a word missing here, abetale umafsede tamre. This would attract the ravens because the blood attracted the ravens. They would eat the blood, and then they would go and sit in the palm tree, and they would ruin the dates. Okay, how they ruin the dates, either they were eating them, basically causing them a loss. They wouldn't have noticed the tree as much if it didn't have all the blood near there. Or they were, they would eat the blood, and then they would go up to the dates, and they would get blood all over his tree, which might connect with later in the story. He's going to call himself an istinis, which is someone who's very disgusted by things pretty easily, a very particular person. So perhaps it was that they were getting blood all over his dates, and that was just disgusting. Whatever they were doing, they were somehow ruining his dates. So basically, what we have here is the bloodletters were causing damage to his tree by being there. If they're being there, brought the ravens, and then the ravens would destroy the tree. So Amar lahu Rav Yosef, afifu li kor mehacha. Get these kor. Okay, most people think this is the way he called the ravens because they make the noises kor. So get rid of these kors from here. I want these ravens out of here, but really what he was saying is, I want you to get rid of the bloodletters. Amar le Abaye v'hagramahu. Abaye says that this is indirect damages, right? Which we were talking about yesterday. What do you mean, right? It's obviously indirect. So how can he kick them out? Amar le hachi amarav tuvi parmanas. He quotes the end of yesterday's daf. Zot omeret, we can infer from here, which was they infer from the previous section. Grama b'nezikin aser. From here, you can learn that you're not allowed to cause indirect damages. While you might not be liable for it and pay, you might not have to, the bloodletters wouldn't have to pay the damages, but we can kick them out to prevent them from creating a situation where they're causing indirect damages. And therefore, Rav Yosef says, get rid of them away from my house. So the first claim against him that it's grama is basically rejected. Okay, there's Gefet that's going up. I hope it'll go up today. I'm not sure. Sometimes I know the Hebrew is supposed to go up today, but the English takes a little while sometimes. So English hasn't come yet, but hopefully there'll be an English version of the Shir of Rabbi Chana Dreyfus, which is usually done by Shalhevet Schwartz, on this topic of grama. Okay, and a very fascinating topic. There's grama, there's garme. If you remember, we learned this all in Bava Kama. And particularly here we have a fascinating issue, which is it's asur, right? And the way we understand it is, but you're actually not obligated. right? So here it's interesting. You can't obligate someone to get out of town, and stop causing me indirect damages, even though you can't make them liable for the money. So if you want to go more in depth into that topic, which is really interesting, you can listen to the Geffen. Second question, but wait, ha-ichziku. Okay, we're going to deal a lot with chazaka. Okay, ichziku lahu. Okay, what does that mean? Well, these bloodletters have been doing this for we don't know how long, but there's a concept in halacha, and we're going to talk about this more also later today, that, okay, the real big chazaka issue comes up with chazaka of 3 years. If I've been living in a piece of land for 3 years, and I've been eating the produce from there for 3 years, and no one's complained and kicked me off the land, and, okay, one thing, we're going to see this later today, I have to claim, not that I was just a squatter, but I have to claim that I actually purchased the land. If I want to claim I'm an owner of the land, I can't just say, oh, I was squatting on the land, no one complained. I have to say I bought it somehow. I have to have some claim that goes with it of ownership. We just assume that after 3 years, I might have lost my star, my document that proves that I bought it. So after 3 years and no one complained, we assume no one complained, so we let it go. That's called creating a chazaka. It's Chizkat Shalosh Shanim. The 3rd chapter of Bava Batra expands on this in great manner. So now we're going to use the same concept. Now here it doesn't come up 3 years, but there's a concept. If somebody does something and nobody complains, then you create facts on the ground. So that's the Chizkat Shalosh Shanim. We assume that if someone owned the land and saw you taking the produce, over the course of 3 years, at some point they would complain. So now they come and say to Rav Yosef, well, these bloodletters have been working in the land already. They've been, not working in the land, but they've been using your space. We don't know how long, okay? It doesn't necessarily have to be 3 years. 3 years has to do with the document and the purchase and all that. But they've been using this and you've never complained until now. So don't they have some sort of rights of just having facts on the ground? And they've been doing this and you can't just kick them out. Ha'amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Ravua, and chazaka l'nizakim. So the response is, now it's unclear if this was a discussion with Rav Yosef or the Gemara just says this, but it seems like it's a discussion because eventually Rav Yosef's going to have the last word. But right now we're going to say, but Rav Nachman said in the name of Rav Ravua, there's no such thing as chazaka when someone's causing you damages. This is a very fascinating line, and we're going to get into this much more in depth in Daf Nun, which is that if this is classic, okay? Your neighbor is causing damage to you. It's maybe not major. Usually major damages, you're going to start complaining. But Rav Nachman says basically, if they're causing you damage and you don't complain, you can't just wake up one morning and start complaining, right? It's almost like a teacher getting a kid in trouble, right? You've been talking in class all day. They don't say anything. And then all of a sudden, at the end of the day, they punish you at the end, and say, you've been talking all day. And you're like, you didn't warn me. You didn't, right? You didn't say anything. What? All of a sudden now you. So it's almost like that, although it's different. We assume that you didn't complain. And now all of a sudden you complain. Well, in this case, when it's damages, we just assume that you let it go. But if you're getting damaged by this, the neighbor can't say, I've been doing this for a really long time. In the end, you cause damage, just like the kid was disturbing in class. So what if the teacher didn't warn them? They were disturbing the class the entire day. Who cares, right? In the end, they did terrible actions and time to punish them for it. So likewise with the neighbor, if they're causing me damage, I basically, what it means is I reserve the right to complain whenever. They can't claim, oh, you didn't complain for all these years. Now you complain. So therefore, the fact that these ravens are ruining my property, they can't create a chazaka on that. They're ruining my property. I can complain whenever I want. To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? That concept, and there's going to be a whole discussion of this in Daf Nun. They're kind of summarizing the conclusion of that discussion is, wasn't it said about that lav itmar Allah? Wasn't it said that Rav Meri Amar Bekutra and Rav Zvid Amar Bebeit Akise? Rav Meri and Rav Zvid narrowed that whole thing. You really can't create a chazaka for nizakim. If there's, a little water dripping into your garden every day, and and it's damaging a little bit of your garden, and you don't complain, you can't just all of a sudden complain. They have a right to just keep having their water drip in because you didn't complain, and it seems obvious that you didn't care. But if it's something like smoke, everyday smoke comes into your yard. Okay, let's just say there's big smokers and they smoke and the smoke comes in. I mean, I don't think that's what they're talking about here. They're talking about, smoke from your oven or something like that. Or they have an outhouse there and the smell comes into your house every day, those are really bothersome things that if you didn't complain, you always reserve the right to complain about them because they're so bothersome. So we're going to allow that kind of situation, but only when it's in that extreme. We're going to say there's no chazaka for damages. Otherwise, there is a chazaka for damages. And how they got to this, you'll see when we get to Daf Nun. But the fact is, that's the conclusion of that sugya. So you can't say en chazaka l'nizakim. This isn't in the same category. To which Rav Yosef says, Amarle, hane lididi. For me, these things for me, da'anine da'atai, I'm an istinis. I'm very particular. I'm very disgusted by things very easily. Ki kutru beta kise damuli. The fact that, and again, you have to figure out what the issue is here, but perhaps it seems like either I love my dates so much that the damage caused the fact that I don't have dates anymore because I ate them is so difficult for me. Or the fact that there's blood on them is just disgusting to me and I'm horrified by it. And for me, it's like the smoke or the outhouse. So basically what he's saying is don't bring that claim en chazaka l'nizakin on me because, right, for me, right, or basically, sorry, he's saying don't bring that explanation of it on me because this really is part of en chazaka l'nizakin and therefore they can't create any sort of chazaka and I can get rid of that. He seems to have the bottom line here. Okay, both on the grama issue, which is grama b'nezikin is usher, and therefore I can kick them out. And they can't create a chazaka here because I'm allowed to always pull out that card and say, this is bothering me. Okay, new Mishnah. It's actually a little bit, you could think of it otherwise, which is if it's so bothersome, then you really should have complained earlier, right? It could work but in both ways, this concept of it's so bothersome that you always reserve the right to complain. On the other hand, one could say the other way, which is if it's so bothersome, right, you should have complained. And the fact that you didn't complain means you don't care. But that's not what the Gemara says. I'm just sort of suggesting that's another way to look at that. Okay, now we're going to start a new Mishnah. We're going to do 2 Mishnayot today. You have to distance, if you have a dovecote, you have to distance it 50 cubits from the city. Why? Because there's a concern that the animals will eat the seeds, either the seeds that are in the ground, the people are planting, or the doves are, right, if you're basically, this dovecote would attract the birds. So you're going to bring, you're going to have, or it's not actually, the truth is it's not really attracting here. The issue is really the next line is going to be attracting them. The issue is if I'm breeding them, there's going to be a lot of doves around. They're going to go take other people's stuff. Also, people would leave grains out to dry. They like, these dried roasty grains. So they would leave them out to dry on their roofs. And also the birds would come and just eat them. So I can't do that because it's again going to cause damage to others. Below yaseh adam shovach betoch shelo, and even in my own field, if there's a nearby field, let's say I'm far away from the city, there's another field near me, elen ken yesh lo 50 malachot ruach. I have to make sure there's 50 cubits of space between me and all the nearby fields so that they don't eat in anyone else's field. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he gives a totally different measurement. And it's very confusing, this Gemara, because I'm going to have to translate, right? You need like one of those convert apps because we're going to keep talking in different measurements, different types of measurements. Rabbi Yehuda says Beit Arba'at Korim, okay, which is a field where you can plant 4 core. If you remember, core is 30 se'ah, okay? Basically, the space here we're talking about is 273 cubits. So you're talking a big difference from 50 cubits, okay? He says not 50 cubits in each direction, you need 273 cubits in each direction. It's actually 273.68. Okay, anyway. Tov. And that's if I remember, it's like 75,000. I think if I have the numbers right, 75,000 square cubits. So it's the square root of that. Milo sheger hayona. He says that's as far as I was going to say as far as the crow flies, right? It's as far as the dove flies. That's the basic flight of a dove is that length. So therefore, you have to distance way more than that. Ve'im lekacho. However, if you purchased a field and there was a dovecote in it, afilu beit rova, even if it was the size to plant a quarter of a kav, which is a really small amount of distance, harehu b'chezkato. This is a fascinating concept, which we're going to discuss in the Gemara. Again, going back, I told you we're going to get back to issues of chazaka. If we already have a chazaka here, which is I bought a field and there's already a dovecote there right next door to my neighbor's field. Now, even though it says I have the distance of 50 cubits, or according to Rabbi Yehuda, 273 cubits, if it already exists and it's already right next to your field, we have to assume that either you guys came to an arrangement and neighbor, right? Let's say it's you. I bought it from someone else and they were living right next to you, that either you agreed to it or maybe they paid you money to allow them to put the dovecote there and they kind of compensated you in advance for this. And therefore, it's like we said before, facts are on the ground. It's already there. And therefore, we assume I can buy it. I was thinking right now, it's like when you buy a house and you have, whenever you buy, you have to go to the municipality, you know, they check out and then they say, oh, this was built illegally and you have to take it down, right? This is the opposite. We assume if it was built legally and it was all legit and you wouldn't have to take it down. I think maybe the opposite, right? What do you mean? This dovecote here, it's not allowed to be here. Time to start from scratch. But no, there's laws of chazaka. You can create a chazaka. We're going to get back to this because what do you mean? En chazaka l'nizakin, right? In other words, this is causing damage. You can't create a chazaka if it's causing damage to your neighbor because the birds could be eating in their field. But we already know the answer, which is that's not the kind of damages there's no chazaka for. It's only for the smoke and all that. We'll get there. The first thing they're going to have a big issue with is the numbers here, because the Mishnah says 50 cubits. And, you know, Rabbi Yehuda obviously says 273. But Uraminhi, that 50 cubits, Vitulo, what, not more than 50? But wait, there's a contradiction from the following Tannaitic source. And here we get to the traps. You can't put up traps to get birds. Okay, the issue was, and we talked about this before, it's actually, if I remember, it comes up in Gittin in the Tikkun Olam Sugya, because this is all Tikkun Olam about stealing birds. People who would attract birds, okay, we'll get to it also in Sanhedrin with people who are mafrichei yonim, they try to bring doves to them, they try to attract them, or are considered, in a sense, thieves, because people somewhat own the doves. You can't really own them because the doves fly and they go where they want. They weren't tied down or, you know. So they sort of own them, but sort of not. It's like a little bit of this murky area. But because, so you put up a trap, you're going to attract all these birds. They're going to come from other owners. And then it's like you're stealing, okay? They say really because of Tikkun Olam, it's considered theft. It's not really theft because they're somewhat ownerless, but they're not exactly ownerless. So you can't put out traps liyonim, ela in ken haya rachok min hayishuv 30 ris. You have to be 30 ris. Okay, 30 ris doesn't help us. What's 30 ris? 30 ris is 4 meal. I'm giving you the 4 meal because in a minute we'll get to the meal, which is also 8,000 cubits. So you're talking not 50, not 273, but 8,000 cubits. You have to be far away from any sort of place where there's people living, because they might have yonim and you're going to trap their yonim and steal them. So why is, if we're worried about, you know, how the dove flies, which we said is 273 or even maybe 50 cubits, so how do we get to this number of 8,000 cubits? Seems to contradict. So Amar Abaye, Meshat Shaite Tuva, Ukrasayu B'cham Shinam Tamalia. Well, there are two different issues. One is, if I have my dovecote here, my doves are going to eat in other people's fields. Well, the dove is obviously going to not fly really far to eat. They're going to fly nearby. And within 50 cubits, they could find enough food to eat. So they're not going to go any farther than that for their food. But if you're trying to attract them, they could fly as far as 30 ris, 8,000 cubits. So when it comes to attracting them and stealing them from other people, we're going to have a different measurement because, you know, one has to do with what they're eating and one has to do with trapping them and how far they can fly. So even though they can fly farther, they're not going to fly that far to eat. So they'll be satiated with eating nearby. Vahatanya, but umeshat shloshim ritz v'tulo. Okay, so we got that, the two different measurements. But now we're going to say, wait a minute. This source we just brought says 30 ris, which is 4 meal, okay, which is 8,000 cubits. But let's go with the 4 meal. 4 meal is the amount that we assume the birds are going to fly. So therefore, don't put up traps within that distance from a city where people are living, because you might steal their birds. But it says, Vatanya b'yishuv, if you're living in a settled area, afilu mea mil lo yifros. Even 100 meal, that's 25 times that 8,000 cubit amount, okay? 25 times the 30 ris. So how do we have such different numbers here? Which Rabbi Yosef Amal, b'yishuv kramim, or Rav Amal b'yishuv shavachim. If it's a place where there's a lot of vineyards, or if it's a place where there's a lot of dovecotes, then the doves will fly much farther. And that's the 1,000 meal number. That's when you can't put it anywhere near there because the doves will be able to fly much farther. If there's no shavachim on the way or no vineyards on the way, then they'll fly less, which is the 4 meal amount. Okay, so that's our answer, to which the Gemara says, wait a minute. If there's shavachim on the way, and we're saying, right, distance it 1,000 meals so that you don't get birds from where people have settled. But if there's dovecotes on the way, aren't we worried you're going to get the birds from those dovecotes? So that's what it says. We should be worried about you stealing from the shavachim. This is a great answer to how you would get so far. And we're worried about you stealing the birds from so far away. But what about stealing the birds from all these other dovecotes? Obviously, there's going to be birds there, if doves there, if there's dovecotes. To which they answer, they're going to give 3 possible answers. D-Day, maybe we're talking about, again, this is a little hard to imagine, but maybe we're talking about the shavachim belong to you. So in other words, don't put up a shavach here, right, unless you distance it when you own other shavachim on the way. Of course, the question is how you have those other shavachim if there's a settlement within that distance then, but okay. Ibait ema digoy, maybe it belongs to a Gentile. Now, belongs to a Gentile, we don't care about you stealing. Why don't we care about you stealing? You might remember we learned Mishum Darkei Shalom, you have to worry about stealing from Gentiles. However, this is a case of you're not really stealing. We said already, they're somewhat ownerless. Some people think that the Gentiles, like the Jews, believe that if I had a dovecote and doves came there, they're kind of mine. And they felt a sort of ownership, which is why they forbade it for you to try to steal someone else's, because they have this feeling of ownership, and the Gentiles didn't really think that way. That's one way of looking at it. Hard to believe there was this different approach about it. But other people say, well, it's not really theft. If it was theft, then we would say, well, Mishum Darkei Shalom, you have to worry about the Gentiles. But since they're somewhat ownerless anyway, they're not really owned by them, and it was just instituted on account of Darkei Shalom, we're not going to then say, well, it also that Darkei Shalom applies to Gentiles as well. So that's a possible way of understanding it. Or maybe the Shavachim weren't owned by anybody. They were just left ownerless. And that's how we can possibly explain. It's a little bit of a stretch, but okay. Now we're going to go to the last part of the mission. Even though the Gemara quotes the words Rabbi Yehuda Omer Beit Arba'at Kulim, they're really not dealing with that. They're dealing with the next line. The next line is interesting part, which is I bought land that had already a dovecote in it near your property. I can assume that it's fine and I can leave it there. So Amar Papa V'Tamer of Zvid Zot Omeret. From here we can learn Toanim Lelokach v'Toanim Leyoresh. What on earth does this mean? Well, this goes back to something I mentioned earlier in class, which is when it comes to Chazakav Shalosh Shanim, when we say, I've been living in this land for 3 years and I bought it from, right? Someone claims this land is mine. And I said, what do you mean? I bought it from you. And I've been living there for 3 years and you haven't complained. I prove based on that it's mine. If I just say, I've been living here for 3 years and I don't say, I purchased it from you, and I don't make a claim that I purchased it or I inherited it from my father or something like that, without a claim, I'm not believed. However, there's 2 cases where even if I don't have a claim, the court creates a claim for me, even though they don't know that that's the truth. What would that be? A lokach or a yoresh. Now, in this case, I bought land, okay, from you. And now some third party comes along and claims that land is mine. And it never belonged to you in the first place, okay? So it will go back to our names, Ruth and Naomi. So Ruth buys land from Naomi. And then David comes along and says, it's not Naomi's land, it's my land. Okay? So David says to Ruth, you can't own this land because it's very nice you claim you purchased it from Naomi, which I'm sure you did, but Naomi wasn't the rightful owner. Now Ruth can claim, I was there for 3 years and you didn't complain, or Naomi was living there for 3 years and you didn't complain, or something like that, without producing a claim that I know Naomi bought it from you, because she has no idea if Naomi bought it from David or not. How would she know that? So even without a claim, the court makes a claim for her. And likewise with the Yoresh, if I inherited the property from my father, and I don't know whether my father bought the land, but I can prove that my father lived there for 3 years and no one complained, so I can make a claim of 3 years chazaka, or I lived in the land and no one complained. I can make a 3-year chazaka claim even without the claim of how it got into my property. That's what's called toanim. Toanim means, and this comes up in a whole bunch of cases, where the court will make a claim for you. They'll suggest a claim even though you didn't suggest it yourself. Usually we don't do that kind of thing. We're not trying to help you, with, if you claim this, we can get you what you want. We don't usually do that kind of help. But in cases where you can't really make the claim on your own, the court will help. Now, how do we get that from here? Okay, let's go back to our case. So what's our case? If you bought the land from someone and the dovecote's already there, now we have no idea why the dovecote's there. It could be you said, I don't care that the dovecote's there, it's fine with me. Or maybe the original owner purchased rights from you. We have no idea. But the court allows you to stay in this land because basically, ta'anina, we can make up as if there was a claim, even though we don't really know what it was. There was a legitimate reason why the shavach was there. So it's the same thing, and comes Rav Zvid or Rav Papa, we're not sure which one, and says, one can infer from our Mishnah the following law about a lokech and yoresh. To which the Gemara says, well, you don't need to learn that from here because yoresh tanina. There's already a Mishnah about this. Haba mishum Yerusha ino tzarich ta'ana. Says if you come from Yerusha and you have a chazak of 3 years, you don't have to bring a claim of how it got to your father's possession. So if it already says in the Mishnah, we don't need this Mishnah to teach us this halacha. It's already in another Mishnah. To which they say, fine, it's not for the yoresh, it's for the lokech. Lokech eats strichale. It's needed for the lokech case. To which they say, lokech nami tanina. What do you mean? There's also a Mishnah about the lokech. And what they're saying is our Mishnah taught us about a lokech, and once it said lokech, it's we'll add the yoresh, even though it's not necessary. But the lokech also was mentioned in the Mishnah. How so? Lakach chatzer. This is different. It's not a chazak of 3 years, but it's a different claim. I bought land, a courtyard. Ubad zizim ugezus taraot. Now, in this courtyard, there's these beams that are or porches that are coming out of the wall that are in the space of the public domain, and it's getting in people's way. Okay, it's obviously the height that's bothering them, and it's a hazard to the public. Now, I'm not allowed to do that kind of thing. I can't build something coming out of my property that juts into the public domain. So if I bought a courtyard and there were already there zizim ugezus traot that went out into the public domain, we can leave it in your property and assume that it was done properly. Like, for example, we'll see in a minute, perhaps it really wasn't your property, and then later the public domain kind of encroached on your property and they turned this space into public space, but it might not have been public space originally. So again, as long as you can prove that it got there in a proper manner, and you now have a chazaka on this, right? When the public domain encroached on your property, they knew that those zizim were there. They didn't make you take, right? They're not going to make you take them down. That's unfair. So if it was there for a fair, legitimate reason, but we don't know, we just assume. So it's the same thing. So the Gemara says, Tzricha, you still need our Mishnah to tell you because you can distinguish. You might have said, well, in terms of the public domain issue, like the zizim and gezus traot, you could say the imor kones letoch shalohu. Either it wasn't his property, and then only later it became public property, like I said, or the Bnei Reshut Rabim said, we don't care, we're fine with this. But in this case, it's an individual. Maybe the individual wasn't okay with it, or maybe it wasn't done in a permissive manner to begin with, right? We don't know. So that's why you needed our Mishnah also. And if you just had our Mishnah, you would say, right, the main difference is there it's public domain, and in our case, it's one person. So we're going to distinguish in both directions, right? Maybe it wasn't a public domain to begin with. And you can't say that here, the neighbor was living there already. So, and there's missing a word here according to the Bach, b'mamone. Maybe, like I said before, maybe you paid off the neighbor. Maybe the original owner paid off the neighbor and paid for the right. So when you buy that property, you get it with all of its rights. Inami achule achel gabe, or maybe the neighbor said, I don't care, it's not bothering me. Aval rabim, but when it's a lot of people, like the public domain, man pais uman shavit. There is no one person to say, oh, you can buy the rights from me. It's everybody, anyone who passes through. And if you're going to say there's mechila, which they did suggest before, but who exactly Reshut Rabim is going to say, I don't care that this is here. One person might be bothered by it, one person might not be bothered, one person might be bothered by it. So emalo, you might have thought, maybe it doesn't work. We can't claim, oh, this is okay. Tzricha. And that's why you really needed both the Mishnah and the other Mishnah about the lokech. Harehu b'chezkato. now we get back to this issue of the same issue, which is if I have the dovecote there already and it's right near your property, we can say, I have a chazaka about this. Rav Nachman, I already told you we were going to get to this. Amar Rab Ravua, in chazaka l'nizakim. But didn't we say there is no chazaka for damages? And you can always claim, like, now I bought this land. The neighbor could say, hey, that dovecote's really bothering me. The doves are coming and eating my seeds. So, Rav Mary, Amar Bakutra, even if you're an istanis, this has nothing to do with, smoke damage, or smoke inhalation and the smell of the outhouse. Those are the kind of damage you said there's no chazaka for. But eating your seeds, that's a different story. That doesn't come in the category here, and therefore it's not an issue. Okay, you can't say in chazaka l'nizakim. And moving now to the next Mishnah and Amud. Nipul hanimtza betoch hamishim ama. If there's a dove chick, we're assuming it's a chick can't really fly, so they can't get so far. So a dove chick that's within 50 cubits, now we're talking about different law, which is we find a dove chick here. And remember, I distanced my dovecote 50 cubits, so there's no dovecote within 50 cubits from here. So if it's found within 50 cubits of my dovecote, harei shabala shavah, we assume it's mine. I can claim rights to this dove because where else would it have come from? If the dove chick is found outside the range of 50 cubits from my dovecote, well, then whoever finds it gets to keep it. We assume it's ownerless. What if it's found between two dovecotes? How do we know whose it is, right? We might be 50 cubits from each other, but this dove is not, right? It's right in the middle, let's say, or somewhere in between. It could be mine, it could be theirs. So, karov lezeh, this is classic laws of doubts, and we're going to get into a basic sugya here about doubts. Karov lezeh shalo, we go by whoever it's closer to. Whoever it's closer to, this sounds like a sugya in Bava Metzia, right? Whoever it's closer to gets to keep it. And now it's really going to sound like Bava Metzia. Mechzal, if it's found smack in the middle, shneim yachloku. We split it 50-50. Okay, obviously, we don't cut the bird in half, right? We split the value of it. One keeps the bird and financially, compensates the other. So now let's forget about our Mishnah for a brief moment. And now we're going to go to, the Gemara often does this. They quote some other sugya, and then they start bringing questions on the sugya from Tanaitic sources. And we're going to see that the sources 2 and 3 are going to be quotes from our Mishnah. So yes, it sounds like Egla Rufa, which is coming up right now. So Amar Rabbi Chanina, Rov v'karov, holchim achar harov. Comes Rabbi Chanina and makes the following declaration. There's different issues we have that resolve doubts. And both of them actually are by Torah law, as you mentioned, Becky Egla Rufa, and as we're going to see right now about Rov. The Torah says, Acharei Rabim Lahatot, which is really the court, but we use it for all things, which is we follow laws of Rov, majority rules. Okay, say we go by the majority if we have a doubt. If you remember the kosher stores and the non-kosher, and a piece of meat comes, there all depends on what the case is. We're not going to get into all the details, but generally we follow majority. So that's a Torah law. But when it comes to Egla Rufa, which is there's a dead body found on the road in the middle of nowhere, we measure to the closest city, and we assume that whoever murdered this person must have come from the closest city. And there we make an assumption based on what we call karov, and that's also a Torah law. What if you have both rov and karov? Then which one wins out? Okay, remember there's also, when there's rov and there's chazaka, and which one is more important? We take all these principles that we use, and the Gemara tries to evaluate which one's stronger, which one wins out. So Rabbi Chanina says, Rov v'karov, we follow majority. But and he points out, even though the Ruba right, the Korva right, even though they're both Torah law, afilu hachi Ruba adif. He doesn't tell us why. He just says Rov is what determines. So now we're going to start with questions. Mativ Rabbi Seva. V'haya ha'ir ha'krova l'chalal. Now, Egla Rufa, that's the quote from the pasuk there, the city that's closest to the dead body, we rule, that's it. Now, even though perhaps there's a bigger city, right? Let's say you have a little, town, okay? And then you have New York City. And New York City is a little farther away from the dead body, and the town is closer. What are the chances are there's so many more people in New York City that we're going to assume the murderer must have come from New York City, right? Wouldn't you say Rov would be Kovea? And yet that's not the way we do Egla Rufa. It's Karov. We don't consider how many inhabitants were in this city and how many inhabitants were in that city. That certainly doesn't come up in the Torah. So the Gemara says, as a response, Bideleika. Maybe there is no other city that's larger than the city they measured to. In other words, they measured to the closest city, and if that city has the same amount of people as in all the other cities nearby, then then we go by the nearest city. If there happens to be a city like Tel Aviv or New York City right nearby, then we're gonna go by that city. Well, if you're going to say that this whole law of Egla Rufa is when there's no other big city nearby, but there's got to be some city somewhere in the world that's bigger. So still, Rov Karov, if Rov always wins out. So go say, well, even though we're in Israel, there's New York City around the world, and maybe the murderer came from there. Who knows? Obviously, in those days, they didn't have air travel, and it wasn't places that far. But what they're saying is there must be some city, or you could just say the inhabitants from there are going to be more than here. So you can always really come up with Rov. So this really does seem to say Karov is more important. To which they say, Biyoshevet ben Haham. Okay, we're really limiting Egla Rufa case. It would be where the Egla Rufa dead body the Egla Rufa case, which is the dead body that we find there, is in between mountains. And there's no way that someone came both from far away and climbed over and under these mountains to get to this place. It would have to be someone in the area, and therefore we're going to go by Karov. Okay, again, assuming that whatever's Karov, they're all about the same size city, and that's why we ruled here. It's very stretched to answer like this, but okay. Second problem, and I said the next two problems are going to come from our Mishnah. So you find this dovechik within 50 cubits. It belongs to the owner of this shavach. But I could have had a small dovecote here, and you have a really large dovecote. So wouldn't we say, if you have a large dovecote some distance away, even though it's farther, we should go by your larger dovecote? Chances are the chick came from your dovecote. To which they answer, Bideleika. Now there isn't any bigger one. But then the seifa doesn't make any sense, because then it says, now, if it's outside 50 cubits from the range of my dovecote, then whoever finds it gets to keep it. Now, Ideleika, if there are no other dovecotes in the area, right, they're actually assuming there's no other dovecotes at all, then Vadai me'ahu nafil. Well, then clearly it fell from me, because the doves must, congregate in dovecotes, and therefore there's no way that even if it's outside the 50 cubit range, it should still be mine because there are no other dovecotes here. So hacha b'mayaskinan b'midadeh. They say, wait, we're talking about a chick. Now a chick can't fly yet. What does it do? It kind of hops, right? That's midadeh. Ta'amar of Ukva bar Chama, kol midadeh ein midadeh yoter mi-50 amah. So Rav Ukva made an assessment that, and this is going to be important, okay, the rabbis always like to give shiurim for things, like this is the amount. The amount we assess that a chick can walk is only 50 cubits. So if I have my dovecote, and there's this dove chick that's without 50 cubits beyond there, then they didn't come from me, because a dove chick can't get that far. So therefore it can't be mine, and that's so there could be, it could be there's no other real dovecotes in the area, but this dove chick must have come from somewhere else because it's outside my 50 cubit range. Once it goes outside my 50 cubit range, there's no way that the dove chick came from my dovecote, because this rabbi assesses that they can't hop more than 50 cubits. Well, by Rabbi Yirmiyah. Remember Rabbi Yirmiyah, our favorite Rabbi Yirmiyah? He loves to ask these nunicky questions. Well, this is a very famous line, a very famous story of Rabbi Yirmiyah. And we're going to continue the story on Daf Kuf Samachay. We have a while to get there. And there's a whole din and daf this week on it, if you haven't seen it yet. By Rabbi Yirmiyah. Raglo echad betoch 50 amah, raglo echad chutz me-50 amah mahu. Now, there's an assumption here that if it's beyond 50 cubits, then it can already fly. And if it can already fly, then it could have come from somewhere else. If it's within 50 cubits, then we assume it's from me because it can't walk. It can only walk, it can't fly. So what if it's got one leg out and one leg in? Do we say it's the kind that flies, or do we say it's the kind that walks? Okay, so In other words, and then, by the way, we can say maybe it came from some bigger shovach somewhere else, okay? So now, right, then Rov would be Koveh. So Rabbi Yirmiyah asks this question, you say 50 cubits, what if it's one leg in, one leg out? What do we say? Well, the response was, Al da afkula Rabbi Yirmiyah mi bein midrasha. With this question, it was like the straw that broke the camel's back. They said, enough with your questions, out of the Beit Midrash. Now, the big question, I didn't have a chance to listen to Nindaf, so I don't know what Alana does here, but I assume that the big question is, what was the problem with this question? What exactly crossed the line here? Okay, so Rashi says, Shayamatriach alehem. It was bothering them, right? It's nice to ask questions, but sometimes it's too much, right? We like to say any question is a good question. And, it's one of the things I like to always say, no question is a bad question. But sometimes the questions just get you so off topic that it's just an annoyance and you can't learn because you're busy answering these silly questions. Tosfot says that it's much more than that. Tosfot says that it goes back to the rabbis determine shiurim for things. And if you start to question them, you're basically disrespecting the rabbis and saying, 50, what about 50.1? What about, right? And it was really a question that was like a stabbing in the back of the rabbis. Like, what's all these numbers? What about the decimals? What about, and it was really a disrespecting of the rabbis. Now, why did I say we're going to get back to him on Daf Kuf Samachay? Because on Kuf Samachay, okay, he missed most of Baba Batra in the Daf Yomi. Kuf Samachay, they're going to bring him back into the Beit Midrash, okay? So we're going to lose him from here to there. Back on Kuf Samachay, we're going to see on what basis do they bring him back into the Beit Midrash. But right now, they kick him out. And listen to Dina Daf, and you'll hear what Alana has to say about this topic. Okay, so that resolved our question about Rov and Karov in the Nipul, okay? Because we're going to say it could only hop, and that's why we're going to go by this and not anything out there. Tashma, last source, again from our Mishnah, last question here for today. Nimtza ben shnei shavachot. This one's very clearly against Rabbi Chanina, because Karov lezeh shelo, Karov lezeh shelo, right? We're going to go by Karov and not by Rov. Right? It didn't say we go by, even as long as this one's bigger, and therefore, what if one's bigger? Then wouldn't you assume it would just come from, if we go by Rov over Karov, it should go by the one who had the bigger dovecot. So obviously, the Gemara is going to say, Shavim. Going to say, well, they're both equal. To which they then answer, again, if Rov wins out over Karov, then why are we going between these two? What about Leza Bataruba da Alma? There's the whole world. And there's someone who's got a bigger dovecot than these two people. So why don't we go after Rov? So we're going to end with this question and we'll get back to it tomorrow. So reviewing our daf, we started with the case of Rav Yosef and the bloodletters and the whole issue of, number one, indirect damages, and this concept of you can't create a chazaka for damages. Right? In other words, again, if they didn't complain, they can always complain later. And therefore, they can always get rid of people, which we then limited, though, to only certain cases, which Rav Yosef claimed, oh, well, mine is like the smoke and the outhouse case. Then we went to the distancing or shovach because they might eat the grains. And then we had two different measurements in the Mishnah. Then we compared it to cases in the different sources, which seem to give much larger amounts about trapping. But we said, no, trapping is different from eating. Eating is much smaller. Trapping is much larger. Although even there we had two different measurements. And we had to resolve how that could be. And we said, well, doves fly much farther in certain areas where there's vineyards or other dovecotes, and then they can fly much farther, and that accounts for the larger number there for the trapping. And then we got to the issue of if you buy it, you already have a chazaka there, even though you don't really have a claim. You don't really know why the person got this shavach, and from there we learned to this halacha that there are certain cases where the court will produce a claim even though they don't even know whether it's true or not, and this is one of them, and we learned from here the lokach and yoresh, and then we said, well, we learned them there too. Why do we need it here specifically? And we said what each one provides is unique. Then we got to, right, how can you create a chazaka if it's causing damage, right? So I bought this and there was a chazaka on the ground because it was already there, but on the other hand, it's causing damage. But again, not the same damage as the smoke of the outhouse. And then from there, we got to this chick and it was the laws of how do we determine who's the owner of the chick? And really the laws of the Mishnah seem to all indicate karov, whoever's closer, to which then we got to this halacha of Rabbi Chanina, who said when there's Rov and there's Karov, Rov always wins out, to which we asked three questions, one from Egla Rufa, one from the beginning of our Mishnah, and one from the latter part of our Mishnah. And then we resolved all of them so far, although we're in the middle of the last one ended with a question. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a great day.